Hi all, hope we're staying safe and well. Today's lesson we're going to be looking at Love's Philosophy by Percy Shelley. Now this is a sharp contrast to the previous video, which is Porphyria's Lover, which was an absolutely epic extended monologue, if you like. Now this one is much shorter, it's much more traditional in the sense of a loving relationship and how romanticism uses natural imagery to create effect. So I hope this is really useful for you. Like I said, as you're going through, if you'd be taking notes or you could potentially be using a Mitzel grid, either way it works really well with this poem. There's a lot of imagery within this poem. It is fairly simple to get your head around. Hope this is useful for you. Okay, as I mentioned in the introduction, Percy Shelley was a classic romantic poet. He was a contemporary of Lord Byron, who we've already met within the anthology. So we are talking about classic romantic ideas, the use of the natural world to inspire romance, and the way in which they can use high metaphors to express the deepness and the passion of human emotions. So Shelley very much does this within this poem. So as we're reading it for the first time through, keep an eye out for this idea of natural imagery and start to think about how the poet has applied this to express the deepness of a human connection. So here we go. The fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with the sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single, all things by a law divine. In one another's being mingle, why not I with thine? See the mountains kiss high heaven, and the waves clasp one another. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. And the sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth, if thou kiss not me? So the meaning of Love's Philosophy, if we look at the actual contents of the poem, what we can see is a mixture of natural imagery and vocabulary to do with blending and mixing and combining things together. What Shelley is doing is this is a personal address to a woman who he is hoping to seduce, or a woman who he is hoping to be romantically attached to. And Shelley's argument is that in the natural world there are countless examples of things mixing and bonding and being together. Why can't we do the same thing? So it's a lamenting poem. It's a poem that is a personal address to the object of his desire, the woman of his desire. And the meaning of the poem is to show that if the natural world can do this, then why can't we? And to show that it's a natural thing to love, it's a natural thing to be together. So this poem uses these range of metaphors, these range of ideas to develop that. So when you're looking through the poem, start to identify, okay, these particular images and the use of Shelley's vocabulary where he's looking at bringing things together, combining things, mixing things, as that is the overall meaning, the central thrust of his argument. The imagery within the poem is probably the most important aspect to consider when looking at Love's Philosophy. It's the easiest thing to analyse, and there is so much of it within the poem that it's very easy to pick on a range of different ideas, especially if you're planning an essay. There's a lot of different aspects that you would potentially look at. So, for example, if we look in the first stanza, we have the fountains mingling with the river and the rivers with the ocean. So we can imagine the image of all the water gathering together and all these different forms of water meeting in a particular place, like all rivers heading towards the ocean. We have the winds of heaven mixing forever in a sweet emotion. So we can imagine the air itself being mixed and being brought together. Nothing in the world is single, all things by a law divine. So we have this idea of the image of a natural law and order, showing that by mixing and putting things together is the natural and correct way to do things. In the second stanza, we have the mountains kissing high heaven. So we have the imagery of the mountains kissing heaven, the height and the connection between the mountains and the sky. The waves clasp one another. So again, we have that imagery of holding close and holding tightly with those waves. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. So we can imagine the flowers all stood in a row and them all being together, and none of them are isolated, none of them are alone. They are grouped together. The sunlight clasping the earth and the moonbeams kissing the sea. So we have this imagery of light and the associations that go alongside it, the positivity, the warmth, the idea of life being associated with light. And again, clasp and kiss, the verb choice here being really significant to look at the idea of holding and being close and romantically linked. So imagery-wise, there is a huge amount that we can look at with love's philosophy. There's lots of interesting use of the natural world and ideas of combinations, and the idea of bringing these natural aspects together to help Shelley to develop his argument about why the couple should be together. Tonally, again, there's some really interesting things going on with love's philosophy. We know already that it is a first-person address to an unnamed partner, an unnamed woman. So that is an interesting idea because we're already getting the fact that it's Shelley's first-person point of view. It's his perspective, it's his ideas, it's how he feels, and that makes it much more emotive and much more passionate. We also have the idea that it is very questioning. So each stanza ends with a question. Shelley is uncertain as to why the woman would want to reject him. So we have why not I with thine at the end of stanza 1, and what is all the sweet work worth if thou kiss not me? So he directly addresses the woman of his desire and asks her these questions. So the tone is very much questioning. It also is filled with certainty, the poem, with the tone, because things like all things by law divine, so it's the certainty, the declarative sense of all. We know that this is to be true. We have very much romantic tone in the sense of all the verb choices that we've talked about already: mingle, mix, emotion, divine. All of those type, that the vocabulary, the semantic field there of connection and emotion and passion is really significant. So really interesting looking at tone and looking at how Shelley goes about his ideas of persuasion. Structurally, when we look at love's philosophy, and if we're looking at any romantic poem, this is a good point to consider the way that the lines and the way that the stanzas have been chosen and how they've been laid out by the poet. So what we have here is a series of couplets. Now, if there's couplets in a poem, it usually indicates the desire to things to be paired up, and that works perfectly with what Shelley's tone and what his message is within the poem, the idea about a deep and emotional connection. So for example, we have the fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. And the perfect rhyme with river and ever and ocean and emotion reflects the idea of Shelley wanting to be paralleled and wanting to be paired and wanting to be romantically involved with the object of his desire. We can also look at the way that the stanzas work. So we have 2 stanzas of 8 lines perfectly paired apart. So now that might indicate that they are currently apart, but Shelley wants to bring them together, or the perfect nature of what their relationship could be if they were to come together. So structurally, that's a very interesting use of pairs and use of parallels within there. I would also suggest have a think about why each stanza ends with a question. Why does it end with that open-ended nature? Is it because the relationship hasn't happened yet, and therefore it is it's unfulfilled, it's incomplete, it's unfinished? That might be something interesting we can look at structurally. Okay, so we've already talked about the use of particular language features and the use of semantic fields, the idea of the natural world being one semantic field. So even if we just look at the first stanza, we have river, ocean, fountains, winds, all of that natural imagery all being linked by the semantic field. We have metaphor. So we have the idea, the use of the natural world being as a metaphor, an extended metaphor, if you like, for the relationship between Shelley and the addressee of the poem. We have the use of declarative sentences, the use of certainty. So for example, nothing in the world is single. we have this absolute certainty from Shelley's point of view, and we have the rhetorical questions that we've already spoken about at the end of each stanza. Why not I with thine? And if thou kiss not me. We have the contrast and the juxtaposition between the natural imagery, but also the verb choices that Shelley is using here, where we have, for example, river, ocean, fountains, and also then we have the verb choices of mingle, mix. We have, again, clasp, kiss, clasp and kiss again. Now, there's lots of verb choices here that's indicative of bringing people together. That idea of the relationship being developing and building from that. We have repetition, and in the second stanza in particular, Shelley uses a series of ideas to try and reinforce his argument. So we have, no sister flower be forgiven if it disdained its brother, and the sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. So he's using more and more evidence to support his argument, to say this is why you should be with me. Now, these are pronouns, again, really, really significant. The fact that I, as the first person for Shelley, gives it a more personal feel, that more developed emotive voice, and the you gives it that personal address, or thine gives it the personal address to a specific person. Now, we never know who this is, but we can infer that this is a very passionate and very deep and meaningful response from Shelley. Okay, so I hope that's been a really useful run through Love's Philosophy with you. The key ideas to take away from this poem are the use of the romantic features of using naturalistic imagery and using that personal appeal. Speaking in the first person voice, Shelley gets across his message and the ideas that he wants to put forward as a romantic seduction. Have a go back through the poem, and for you to do is to complete a Mitzel analysis, looking at those 5 strands of meaning, imagery, tone, structure and language. Now, you can either do this on a grid, or you can do it as a separate set of notes and annotate a copy of the poem if you like as well. A good comparison to make with this poem will be looking at a poem such as Sonnet 29, which is again filled with natural imagery, used in a slightly different fashion, but the comparison between how those two poets do that is really, really interesting and something we can potentially explore in a bit more depth. I hope this has been really, really useful for you, and see you next time.